and I am one of the faculty fellows here and a professor in epidemiology. I just have to remember to communicate about recording. It's really exciting to see everyone here. This is like, I'm just starting to feel like I'm transitioning back to like in-person stuff and teaching in person. So it's nice to see everyone here. So welcome. And it's my absolute honor to introduce Justin Lessler, who we recruited from Hopkins a year ago. Have you been here still over a year? And
Is there a mic that you can use?
the mics are supposedly up here. Can you not hear me very well?
No, I mean, we're trying to sit out here.
Okay, I don't know.
I'll ask him.
Yeah, I'm looking at Jim to be like, is there another I can project? So I'm going to introduce Justin. So he is a professor in the Department of Epidemiology here, and he's the co-founder of the COVID-19 Scenario Modeling Hub. He researches the dynamics and control of infectious disease with a particular interest in SARS-CoV-2, influenza, cholera, and dengue. Justin works on the development and application of statistics, dynamic models, and novel study designs to better understand and control infectious diseases. And in particular, he's interested in creating synergies between infection control practices, data collection, and infectious disease dynamics. And he's going to talk to us today about all the work that he's been doing around COVID and modeling, including which we recruited him before he even got here from Hopkins to do modeling on the data here at UNC to inform the chancellor and others about what was happening. So it's great to have you here, Justin.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for that kind introduction. And yeah, so I'm not going to fulfill the promise to talk about all the work I've been doing in COVID. I'm going to talk about a tiny sliver of it, but I think one that is particularly interesting and continually relevant, and one where I think we're wrestling with some fundamental questions that are worthy of discussion and thought. And that is the COVID-19 scenario modeling hub. So which has been running for now over a year and a half, but I'll really be talking about a year and a half of projection. So the COVID-19, so just to start, I'm going to talk more about what it is now, but I just want to get up front that this is a collaborative effort from a huge number of people. As you saw on the title slide, it's a multi-team effort, and there's a huge number of teams that have contributed, and there's also a huge number of people involved in coordinating it. The slides I'm showing today, a lot of them here, Cecile Vabood and a PhD student at Penn State, Emily Howerton, deserve a lot of the credit for, so I just wanted to get their picture out there here at the beginning. So, start with some motivation. How do we use models in a pandemic? So, I think when people think about epidemic models and think about pandemic modeling, they say, oh, it's for forecasting. And that's generally what exactly jumps to mind. But there's actually a ton of uses for epidemic models, ranging from theoretical modeling to inferential modeling, understanding the world, what I'll call strategic modeling, but we'll sort of change how I talk about it in a minute, and of course, forecasting. And to go through a little bit about what those are and how those, a few examples of how they're used, let's start with theoretical modeling. And so what type of emergent behavior is produced by the disease systems with different properties? How do disease systems that we speculate, we put forward, how do they lead to the distribution of an infectious disease in the population? So you get a lot of work, for instance, on network theory, how different network structures and how the structure of networks, for instance, leads to disease flowing through the population. And this has been very important to our understanding of infectious disease, how we make more operational models, but there are also sort of, potential pitfalls when you treat those theoretical models like maybe they're something else. So this is sort of a famous, analysis from 2020 when several people were making the claim that, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic was just going to go away any day now, because we only need 20% immunity in the population to get rid of it. Yeah, it seems ridiculous now. And this is, got headline, New York Times, what if herd immunity is closer than we thought? And this is based on a theoretical model that says a lot of things about how diseases go through networks, but it doesn't necessarily correctly measure the network or the structure that we're talking about. And I think we can get, one of the places we can get into trouble is when we do that kind of application, treating a theoretical model as if it's a different kind. Despite what I'm going to talk to today, which isn't about mostly today, which isn't this, probably the type of modeling that's closest to my heart is inferential modeling. And that's when we try to use epidemic models. And here I mean like mechanistic epidemic models to understand the true nature of the disease processes that are producing observed health metrics. So for instance, this is really early work for He et al. On some of the earliest cases that occurred in Wuhan, China, and they looked at, potential exposure windows from people who were primarily infected in green, the onset time of people they were infected in blue, and use that to get several key properties of the disease process that we use to understand spread. So for instance, the serial interval, which is the time from when I develop symptoms and the people I infect develop symptoms, and the incubation period, which is how long it is from me getting infected to becoming symptomatic. This is work I did with a PhD student at the time and several other folks using serological data from Geneva, Switzerland, where we used a model of transmission to take data, serological data, cross-sectional data, on how many people in a household were showing signs of COVID-19 infection or SARS-CoV-2 infection, and translate that into estimates of exactly what the probability of transmission was between individuals within households and between households. So for instance, by taking a mechanistic approach to this cross-sectional data, we were able, for instance, to show that within the household, there was about a 17% chance at this time of getting infected from an infected household member, and that was a bit lower among the youngest group individuals and a bit higher among the oldest. Taking some inherent susceptibility there, but when we look at infection from outside the household, which is probably driven more by behavior than biology, you not shockingly saw the peak in working age adults who couldn't stay home during lockdowns and the like. And this has been used to sort of, for very important things like understanding the impact of interventions over time, like population stuff. So on the right there is work I did that sort of suggests interventions work, but people can be very selective about how they use it. Some people have done reviews where they claim they don't. So now I'll talk about a third kind of model, and I'm not going to talk about it a lot now because it's really this and forecasting are really the theme of this entire talk, which is strategic modeling. And that's sort of when we're asking these questions. How will an epidemic unfold under certain control strategies, conditions? How do we respond to this infectious disease threat? So this leads to stuff like we saw a lot during the early pandemic. So this is one of the many invaluable reports from Imperial College from early on, where we have this sort of strategic, curves of like, okay, if we do nothing, this is what could happen. But okay, if we, just do case isolation, this is what's going to could happen. Or if we just close schools and universities, this is what might happen. And this is how well different control measures work. We're not able, this is often done very early in an epidemic, so we're not able to do a lot with data all the time. And we really have to fall back on our fundamental understanding of the biology and social processes that lead to the disease being spread. And then finally, forecasting, which is, quite simply, we're seeing the thing go along. We're over here. This is actually where we are. This is a projection into the future. So I would postulate, just to motivate some of them to say, next, that no matter what their immediate purpose, epidemic models ultimately aim to help us plan, right? Ultimately, even if we're getting fundamental scientific understanding that'll help us later, we really want to be able to plan for the future. So now I'm going to talk about, I said the scenario modeling hub. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about why I and others decided to form the scenario modeling hub back in December of 2020. So here's a quote about models. That they're ridiculously overconfident and wildly unreliable. This is about individual models, but this isn't about disease prediction. This is a quote about weather models. This is a quote about weather models before the modern era of ensembles. So when you see something like this, this is the hurricane code, which we won't. It's famously misinterpreted, and we won't get into that. But this is like the type of thing we're all extremely used to seeing when we see weather forecasts. This is the path of the storm. This is where it's going, and we think of this as like a single projection. But really, what this is an ensemble of a lot of different projections. Oh, I just thought I had this. So, and most of them have things following the course of that cone, but this model out here is like, oh, wait, things might just shoot off to the right up here, or shoot off to the north up here, or this one might shoot off there. And that is, and all of those, any one of these models in certain situations might be quite wrong, but the ensemble of them over time has just proven again and again and again to outperform any single model. So why don't we do the same thing with an infectious disease? And early in the pandemic, Nick Reich and others formed the COVID-19 forecast hub to do just that. And you can see the exact same thing. So here's a point where we're just about to get hit with Omicron, right? So we're coming here, and this is all of the 4-week ahead projections of deaths to the COVID-19 forecast hub. Now, you could look at this, and people have looked at this and said, models are useless, right? There is something going every which way there, and like the 40-odd some models there. And and this is what actually happened, and it's it's in that mix, but and closer to some models than the other, but it's not, you wouldn't necessarily look at all those lines and say, oh, that's what's going to happen. But when you ensemble all those models and you ensemble all those projections, you get a very nice projection of the future that ends up being much more accurate, or at least much more consistently accurate than any given model. And this has been true throughout the pandemic. So this is just a picture from an analysis that they did. This is going through about the Delta wave in 2021. But you can see on their death projections that they're pretty much getting things right all the time with the ensemble. And you can sort of compare it. It's in the red. Compared to all the individual models and sort of a baseline null model, the ensemble is consistently the best performer, whether we're looking at 1 week ahead or even 4 week ahead, at least for deaths. It's not a panacea. So the COVID-19 forecast hub, which has a lot of machine learning models and stuff, has been really good at forecasting deaths, but it doesn't do that well hasn't done that well in cases historically, particularly around these change points where things are shifting up or down. And that, that for that reason, for instance, this all comes from a blog where the folks running that hub decided actually to start pulling the 4 week ahead projections from their main analysis and focusing only on 1 week ahead for cases and deaths. Of course, I'm going to do something it's completely the opposite, or provide something. And so if you're of a certain age, you probably listen to these books. Choose Your Own Adventures. And there's an early phase of the pandemic where I like to refer to as the choose your own adventure phase of the COVID-19 pandemic model. Because you'd see all sorts of models out there that showed completely different things from this is this famous IHME model, showed a peak in May and things going around down. And here's some models from University of Texas. Here's a model we did. And they're all showing wildly different things. And if you have a political agenda or just a predilection in how you view the world, you can go and just point to one of these models and say, hey, that one, that's showing what it is. This is how the future is going to unfold. And therefore, the policy we follow and the like is, should be X. And part of the thing here is, though, these models are not differing really based on they are differing some based on differences in the scientific uncertainty about the world, but they're also, and even more so, different because every one of these is asking a different question. None of these models have the same assumptions about the future of control, of how people will behave and respond. So the IHME model, as much as it has been, maligned, and I think rightfully so, is it was a statistical model assuming lockdowns just occurred through August. That the whole country stayed locked down as it was, actually even harder than it was in April, sort of China-like lockdowns going through August, which that wasn't going to happen. There's a different set of assumptions here about sort of responsive policies going on in the CGA model. Our model was assuming, the lockdowns ended and different strategies came in to replace it. So they're all asking different questions. So you're not really comparing apples and apples if you select among these. So this leads us to the scenario modeling hub and 1.5 years of planning on that. So the goal here was to both take advantage of, that ensembling strength, and also, and maybe even more so for me personally, just get a bunch of people asking the same questions. So we could separate, this is differences because of science or technique, and this is differences because of the questions we're asking. So the Scenario Modeling Hub is a multi-team effort aimed at creating and modeling planning scenarios of the mid to long-term COVID-19 situation. We project hospitalizations, cases, and deaths at a weekly basis, or weekly hospitalization cases and deaths. The scenarios have been developed in close collaboration with government agencies and other stakeholders, including the CDC in particular, but also the White House. To date, there have been 15 rounds, 13 of which are public. I'll talk about the ones that weren't. We have 5 to 10 submissions per round at the national level from 5 to 10 teams. So we're nowhere near the forecast hub, which is 30 to 50, depending on the round. I think they got up to 100 at one point. And we have more at the state level. And results are ensembled and summarized by the hub. This is just an example of some of our projections, but we're going to go a lot into that. And just to reiterate, what we're talking about here is planning scenarios and projections. So, I'm a strong believer that, there's a sort of natural limit to how far ahead you can forecast, right? Because one is just, fundamental uncertainty about random events in the universe, but also a lot of stuff that you just can't reasonably bring into your model are going to change. Policies are going to change massively. New variants are going to arise. We definitely know that now. People are just going to have, there's just going to be changes in how people behave. Unless you're good at, forecasting social change, you're not going to be able to get. So in this range here, I like to stop talking about things as forecasts and start talking about them as projections, conditional on some set of assumptions about how some of these big things that might change will differ in the future. And if we can get everybody on the same page on those, maybe we can give more useful information for planning. So that's why I usually refer to these as planning scenarios. And we need this because governments, people, businesses don't plan on the course of 4 weeks in the future. Sometimes they do. But this has no significance besides being the first non-federal thing that came up when I did a search for economic plan or financial, government financial plan. And this is from the university or from San Francisco. And you can see that there's about 9 months here that this budget process is taking place. So if you're really worried about what the impact of COVID-19 or any other infectious disease is in your far future, 4 weeks back here at the beginning, or even when people are submitting their budgets, is not going to be particularly helpful in your long-term plan. So there's just a need to be able to have something to plan around. And so that's what we've produced with the hub. And I'll go through what some of these look like, but we've had, as I said, 15 scenarios, and I'm going to go through these in a little bit of detail. 2 of which weren't public. One was a practice round. We were introducing something fundamental in terms of the questions we were asking. So we just had the teams do it and say, we're never going to let this see the light of day. That's round 8. And then there's round 10 that we basically were getting ready to finalize, and Omicron hit like a truck. And we said, none of this is valid anymore. So we're going to go and do these Omicron things. Just to, toot our own horn for a moment, we've been, the consumers and users of the projections have been a lot throughout the thing, and sometimes we just hear that people are using them and we have no idea, and we don't know, exactly how they're used. So I got an email from somebody at the Harvard who was like, hey, I'm an actuary. When's the next projection coming out? It's like, okay, I had no idea we had an actuarial audience. But we particularly collaborate with the CDC and the White House, and we've presented our results to ACIP that makes vaccine recommendations, the FDA Vaccine Recommendation Committee, and others. All right, so I'm going to sort of divide, just to give you a sense of what the scenarios look like, I'm going to divide them along 3 themes, somewhat arbitrarily and somewhat following time. So theme 1 is vaccination distribution and non-pharmaceutical interventions. So that's like social distancing or masks. And so the first 5 rounds really focused on that, because here we're talking starting in December 2020 and going through late spring 2020, when the big questions are, when is the vaccine going to be available? How much will actually be manufactured? Once we make it, how much will be, how much will people uptake it? And I will say, for these four rounds at least, or at least the first 3, we consistently underestimated the speed at which vaccine would be available and how many people got it. So just an example of what a scenario looks like, for this, and basically all our scenarios ended up following this format where we said, okay, we're going to have 2 axes and 4 scenarios that sort of are the intersections of those axes. And the goal here is to sort of cover important sources of uncertainty, important sources of scenarios, but actually make things manageable for teams, right? We've often gotten requests, oh, can you do these 10 scenarios that cover all of this uncertainty? And just that's not really feasible. So in this one, we have like a high vaccination scenario and a low vaccination. In the high vaccination, we both assume really good uptake, lots of people administered monthly and really good vaccine efficacy. And in the low, we're kind of pessimistic both on the efficacy of the vaccine and how much uptake there would be. And likewise, in the moderate NPI scenario, we're assuming that, between March and September 2021, there's about a 50% reduction in how much impact non-pharmaceutical interventions and social distancing are having. In the, in the low pessimistic scenario, there's an 80%. So that's what scenarios look like for then. And then our next theme was variants and vaccination. So, as I'm sure you're all well aware of, sort of starting in early 2021 and sort of a steady march to now, the pandemic has really been defined by variants and availability of boosters and the like. So these go from this early B117 or alpha variant all the way through Omicron and even some now. And they tend to look like this in terms of, sometimes we're capturing vaccination, but also we're making these to be useful, like an Omicron is we're trying to make this scenario when we're getting that first trickle of information coming out of South Africa about exactly what Omicron is going to look like. So, our scenarios, so in here, this case, our scenario really focused on, what the variant might look like, sort of scientific rather than policy uncertainty. So we had a lower severity scenario where it was less severe than Delta, which thank goodness was the case, and a status quo scenario. scenario. And then we have a high, then we have amount of immune escape, sort of a high immune escape, lower transmissibility increase, or a lower immune escape, higher transmissibility increase, because there's sort of a balance of those that could explain the data that came in. The virus could be more transmissible, but have less immune escape, or more immune escape and be less transmissible. And then now I think we're in a phase where the theme of the last few rounds, I think, can be summarized as maintenance of immunity. So this includes this practice round that these rounds that never saw the light of day. We kept trying to do this, and then the variants kept coming and mucking everything up. And then we have sort of the last 3 rounds have been first on long-term waning with a hypothetical variant, then 2 rounds on boosters that are very similar. And so here's around 14 assumptions. So on the one axis we had, and these are things we sort of came up with talking with people who were, really intimately involved in the vaccine policy. One is reformulated vaccines available in September for, this is for all adult, sorry, no, this is 14, this is 15. Wait, did I mess up? Okay, this is round 15. So sorry, this is round 15, not 14. So this is timing. So I apologize. So in here, we have this reformulated vaccine coming in available for all adults and 18 and over. And we're assuming that there's going to be flu-like uptake with about a 10% reduction. So we're going to reach numbers that are a lot like the annual flu vaccine, but a little discount factor for the fact people are more hesitant about COVID vaccines. And we are looking at timing here, a vaccine coming in at September 11th, early versus what happens if the reformulated vaccines are late. And then we make an assumption about efficacy of 80%, but against symptomatic disease, but admittedly that is sort of, a shot in the dark because we don't have any data right now. That's hopeful. And then we have a scenario that's sort of like no new variant. We keep the AA5 dominating throughout, or a immune escape variant that has 50% immune escape and some escape to severity coming in the fall. Just to say, we also looked at these where we have the scientific uncertainty. For instance, one of the things that's hardest to know and understand is how much immunological waning is coming. So we have scenarios with that as well. And this is what it looks like. This is only the first 12 rounds for just technical reasons why we've been able to summarize them, because that's when to talk about them in the next couple slides. But these are all the scenarios. So some of these are scenarios where we had assumptions that really deviated from reality, and some of them are very close, and we'll talk about that. And these are projected out of time. And we started truncating what we truncated here when a variant comes around. So alpha, delta, omicron, and sort of invalidates the projection, because we think at the point an unexpected variant that wasn't included in the scenario comes around, the projection is no longer relevant. So these are, the first 12 rounds, and you can see we can argue about how things have done over time, and we'll look at that more. And just because I know people might be interested in what we're projecting for the immediate future, these are the round 15 projections. As of this point, nothing varies between the scenarios in round 15 because we don't have the vaccine yet and the hypothetical variant hasn't emerged. But, basically we're the ensemble is suggesting that things are going to remain high or moderately decrease through mid-fall, and then they'll drop earlier if we have earlier booster campaign, later. And then, of course, if a new variant comes in, things could rocket. And just to explain this figure, because it'll come up a little bit, we here, at some point we decided, putting the little median line wasn't helpful and was misleading about how much uncertainty there was. So this darkest area, that is the 50% projection interval. And then the next lightest is the 80% projection interval. The next lightest is the 90%, and then the final one is the 95% projection. So we're sort of bounding those future trajectories. So I've told you these are planning scenarios, and that these are fundamentally things that maybe aren't going to happen, which brings up a question. How do we evaluate? So in other words, given that the exact assumptions of a planning scenario are almost by definition not going to happen, how should a planning scenario be evaluated? And here's an illustrative example, kind of illustrative, that I think of like what, where you can get in trouble. So these are some of the projections from Imperial College early in the pandemic that really, motivated everybody to take action, right? You have these big, big peaks and, sort of delays or like intermittent control under different scenarios. So there's a lot of different control scenarios being looked here, including this hypothetical, undifferentiated thing. And then in May, somebody who really didn't like the fact that control measures were in place comes out with this assessment to say, okay, this was all BS. But it's May. If you look at these projections, like May is here, right? Like we're not into the beef of any of these projections, but it's showing here, whoever, this person that, I'm not gonna call them out, was saying, oh, look at all of these. And this is how many actual cases we have. This is all buckets, right? And, and a lot of people argued this, but then if you jump forward to May of this year, which is kind of where some of these are ending, like, well, they start looking a lot less crazy. They're still high, but this is also the uncontrolled scenario, right? So they've taken the uncontrolled scenario and evaluated that as a forecast, right? And it shouldn't be. And if anything, if you do evaluate any of these as a forecast, you should be looking at sort of these mitigation, probably this mitigation line, if not this, or the suppression line, depending on the country. And, in this case, well, some of these are right on, some of these are some of these were a bit high, and, none of these have vaccines. So this stops looking like such an insane fantasy when you actually evaluate it compared to what actually was meant to be. Though questions remain, right? Like, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, like, got far fewer cases than, was projected even in the most optimistic scenario. So clearly there were things that could be done that weren't being captured. So how do we evaluate these scenarios? And I'm going to go through this part rather quickly since we're getting on time and didn't want to spend time on the actual results. But I think there are a few ways you could think about it. And one is to do this planning scenarios as forecast evaluation. So you really look at them and say, okay, let's pretend these are forecasts, or pick one of them. Which one best matched what actually unfolded in the world in terms of outside factors? That's a forecast. We're going to evaluate it that way. And I'll just, as a giveaway, that's what I'm going to do today. But there are problems with that, like, what is the plausible null model? And what do we do if none of our scenarios were prepped? How do we decide how we actually did if, say, a new variant comes out 5 days after we made the scenario and invalidates everything? Another idea is planning scenarios as planning scenarios. And that's sort of more taking this idea of if we'd gone out and with some risk tolerance or some approach said, okay, we're going to allocate resources based on these scenarios, maybe based on cumulative cases or peak cases or something like that, would we have allocated the right amount of resources, regardless of what scenario is correct? And that seems to make a lot of sense, though it's unclear what it means to do right on these metrics. And also, does it really make sense not to invalidate a scenario? If 4 weeks in, it's clear that this scenario is not what's going to happen in the world, well, people are going to presumably stop planning around it. So should it be really included in our evaluation study? And then finally, and this is kind of a different way to think about it, is planning scenarios as hypotheses. And in this case, we're maybe evaluating less individual models and more the scenario themselves, right? And it's sort of saying, okay, we've made these projections. So for instance, here are two projections from round 13, one with optimistic waning and one with pessimistic waning, immunological waning. And you see that the pessimistic waning one seems to be more accurate than the optimistic. So maybe that's evidence that for rapid immunological waning. But it does, have its limitations. We assume models are right in evaluating scenario definitions, not models. And then we have, in all of this, we want to compare to something, right? The question for me, if we're talking about planning, isn't are these perfect? It is, would you have more information about the world with these than you would if you didn't have them? And so, you might pick, in that case, you might pick like sort of these naive, sort of generalized additive model projections with some seasonal in here that we have here, but some of these do produce crazy things that you wonder if anyone would ever believe. We also sort of, for comparison, just to take another perspective and say, okay, how do these, compare to how we might have done if we had the best reasonable possible information? Or did, we took the 4-week ahead projections from the scenario modeling hub as an alternate null. So let's see how we did. So this is an evaluation. I've obfuscated team names, but they're all here along the x-axis with the ensemble on the right in each of these outcomes: incidence cases, incident hospitalizations, incident deaths. Bluer is better, and in this case, and the top is us competing against that ideal model, or best possible of the 4-week ahead projections from this forecast hub. And the bottom is us projecting against those GAMs. So if you're blue, you're better than the null model. If you're brown, you're worse than it. So the first thing to take out of this is that, and I think the most important thing is that across all of the outcomes, the ensemble is the best. It's the best. These are skill scores, and I'm not going to go into the technicalities of those, but lower is better. The ensemble is the best, and it is, and that is the case. Across outcomes, and it's consistently kissed, but it's not to mean it's always the best on any given round. So any given round, one model might outperform the ensemble, particularly by quite a bit, or might be one of the best models. So for instance, this doesn't, here, just to take an example, this one doesn't quite outperform the ensemble in this round, but it does as well as the ensemble. This one outperforms the ensemble in this round, A does. But you see the round before, it was the worst model. Right, so this is where we're treating it as forecast. We're picking the most plausible scenario and doing this comparison. So this is good evidence that the ensemble works well. And there's some evidence looking at this that in different themes or different epochs of the pandemic, or however you want to think about it, our performance has changed. So early on, our performance was less good, particularly compared to the forecast hub 4-week projection than it is later, where we've done quite good, in some cases even outperforming the forecast hub 4-week ahead projection. I think one interesting nuance of this is in these first rounds, things were just basically decreasing through July of 2021, right? So it's really easy for somebody to draw a line and predict that. So it could be that we were doing worse, but it also could just be that we had a much easier task for the null model. So, and this is just showing, to give a sense of that with all the scenarios shown, you can kind of see that, we're getting low here, but then things come, and then in this phase, we sort of do, and partially we just do really, really well enough. Another way to look at this is just confidence interval coverage. And I think this is interesting because, one of the things that surprised me is that for some outcomes, for instance, deaths, even though our confidence intervals might not have, didn't get so wide, they were completely non-informative, you didn't see as much degradation over time. And in some of these rounds where we did really well, each of these is a round showing the projection forward in color. The bold ones are the sort of most plausible model. We had really good 95% confidence interval coverage pretty far into the future. And there was less degradation. This gray line is that 4-week ahead forecast hub, and they pretty consistently perform as well or better. That pretty consistently performs as well as better when we compare deaths. But interestingly, even quite far out, sometimes the long projection for the scenario modeling hub are outperforming the forecast hub 4-week ahead on hospitalizations. And I think that has something to do with the forecast hub has a lot of statistical, like machine learning type models in it that can do well in deaths because sort of everything's already in the bank, right? Like it's the cases and all of that are creating the deaths have already occurred, so they can do quite well. Whereas when you look at hospitalizations, a much more acute indicator, if you don't have mechanism, it's much harder to get it right. One interesting question is, like, we picked the most plausible scenarios there for outside, from outside information, and is that actually the one that does the best? And here the dotted line is the 4-week ahead forecast hub, and in some places we didn't really pick it out. But you can see that most of the time the most plausible scenario was the best, but not always. Like sometimes other scenarios were better, and that does, I think, raise a fundamental question, getting to these fundamental questions about evaluation. If we're good in terms of projection, but good for the wrong reason, was that actually a good projection when it comes to scenario model? So another question is, okay, we have these, but do they capture the intuition about performance? And this came up looking at this here, where we have this delta wave here. We have the delta wave here, and here are delta projections, and you can see, I think any of us would say that we didn't get it, right? We did not, those projections did not capture exactly the severity of the delta. And then you look at the decline of the delta wave, we have this projection here, which we start high, but except for the very end, it seems like it's sort of getting it. Or so I thought. But I've had people, somewhat non-technical people, and this is a technical person, this is a non-technical person. This person said, this was a reporter I talked to in the early delta waves, he's like, oh, you guys basically got it. You basically said exactly what was going to happen. There was going to be an increase, and it's going to peak sometime in the fall. And it's like, well, I was like, but we did abysmal. What are you talking about? And then, a colleague of mine, looked at this one, and he was talking to me around here and said, your forecasts are fundamentally misleading, right? Like, even though we're sort of capturing almost to the Omicron time, almost all of the probability space of what actually happened in the direction, it's fundamentally misleading. So I was like, okay, so there's something, and I couldn't fully disagree with either of these statements. And so the question, and just to show, like, if we look at metrics, right, like the 7 and 8, like, or 7 and 9 are the two things we're comparing here. Like 9 is better than 7, and skill score, it's definitely better than 7, and confidence interval coverage, like all the metrics we normally use, it's clearly better. So I think the question is why did they think, why are they saying this? And I think the question is for someone, is it just all about direction? So to look at that, we kind of tried to divide up our projections and the actual data into phases, like, is it increasing, is it decreasing, is it flat? And then evaluate how well compare our projections. So this is sort of 7 and 9 to what was happening there. Interestingly, it did show, I think it gave some interesting insight, if not quite getting that problem. One thing is to say we very rarely, get it 2 steps wrong, right? We very rarely say, okay, it's increasing when it should be actually decreases, or decreases when it increases. But even in our best world, we only sort of get under these metrics, and we can argue about how they should be. Only 60% of the time when it's actually decreasing that we get it, or 40% of the time when it increases. It's better than 1/3. It's better than rolling a die, but it's still not great, not as good as you did. But I think that even misses it. So I think part of the problem, and I think part of the fundamentally wrong that we were dealing with here, comes from what's happening here. Is that it wasn't so much that it missed this increase after being basically spot on or pretty good for several weeks. I think it's that if you were planning around this and you were like, okay, we're good, it's following this, and then it went up, you would be sort of by this past performance really primed to say things are going to keep going down. And I think that's a fundamental question for how we think about people interpreting and evaluating, and one I'm not going to. So now I'm just going to speculate a little bit, go off a little bit, and I'll try to be done quick so there's time for questions. Sorry, I ran over. So the question is, are we in search of an, I think a little meditation, are we using the right analogy? And then, this comes from the fact that, something about what we're saying leads people to either say, okay, this is, sorry, this is a monkey throwing darts. Nostradamus. Okay. Nostradamus. Right, but I think, there's a tendency for epidemic projections and models to be treated one way or another, right? Like either they're perfect, they're going to be perfect projections of the future, or you guys don't know what you're doing, you're throwing, darts at a board. Right, and of course, we always feel like we're Cassandra just saying, this is what's going to happen, and it doesn't. But, and I think some of this comes from this idea that we always default to weather forecasting, right? And we always seem to use that to our analogy because that's where people are most familiar with forecasting, and it arguably is the best. And even by the way we present our forecasts, where we draw these lines and cones of uncertainty, it just brings people to that. So people are in that, but maybe it's more like climate projections. But even here, they're kind of doing this, and I think this is where climate science also has hit problems. Is people look at these and they see them as proper forecasts when they're projections of general trends. So is that the analogy? Or I've been playing with the idea that maybe we get better things if we try to do an analogy if they're planning scenarios around financial planning. Is that the analogy? It's not so much getting it right, it's getting it right enough to act correctly. Right? When you sit down with a financial planner, they're not saying, oh, there's going to be a recession in 2 years. You are going to do. They're saying, okay, there's a decent probability of being a recession in at the time period you're going to plan around, and you need to be resilient to that. So maybe that's the analogy. At least there too, there's kind of this accepted idea of iterativeness, which this is something I made before the pandemic, which I've always thought is a big part of the modeling. Or should it be something new? And just finally, a few closing thoughts about the past and the future. One is over round 15, just to sum up, over round 15, we've shown that our ensemble, the linear opinion tool, yields the most stably reliable projections. So I think that's good. And these projections have informed decisions for stakeholders in government and the private sector. We've explored how policy and fundamental scientific uncertainties influence the unfolding pandemic, and I think been provided useful information there, and tried to confront key questions about how to present and evaluate planning projections, or been confronted by it. That claims that we've always actually tried to find them, but we've certainly been confronted by. And in the future, I think we do have continuing decisions to make about boosters, treatments, and other control measures. And looking at the long-term fate of the pandemic, so there's been a spin-off of the US COVID-19 scenario modeling hub, the European COVID-19 scenario modeling hub. So, and they sort of had limited funding to do rounds. So they sort of ended with a 5-year projection, which, is an interesting question of how useful that is. Reproduce the hub for other diseases. It is being reproduced for monkeypox. We're funded by the CDC to do that, or sorry, for influenza. We're funded by the CDC to do that. Question is this approach useful for concrete problems? I think we need to think about how to make this approach useful early in an emerging epidemic. I think that's when the lack of such a centralized, repository that at least had people asking the same questions had the most negative impact. And how do we prepare for the future? And also, a sort of latent negative of the hub is that there's a bunch of researchers out there who are, both the forecast hub and the scenario modeling hub, who are turning the crank for a regular operational thing instead of using their, pushing forward the science of forecasting and understanding and projection and scenario modeling. And so, could the newly formed Center for Forecast Analytics or CDC or something take over some of that operational turning of the crank to free us up for innovation in a model like it's often used for weather. And just a final note is the pandemic is still here and there's still work to do. Just as, the New York Times today, we're at 460 average daily deaths. That annualizes to 167,000 some deaths a year. That's swamped by cancer and heart disease, but those are multi-cause outcomes, right? So arguably, with the exception of smoking, COVID-19 is still the largest single cause of death. And all that smoking death is like based on smoking that was happening 30 years ago, not that's happening today. And it's, other, supposed disaster, or not supposed, true disasters in our history, it's commensurate with those. So, different people are dying. So as I've said, this is the work of a ton of people. This slide actually is probably 2 months out of date and should include more people. I didn't have time to update it for today, but this is a lot of work, and I'm very happy and leave it at that.
Thank you for your overview. I enjoyed learning more about your modeling efforts. I had a question on the statistics that you're using there. So you're primarily interested in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Right. We know that there's measurement error in each one of those. And we know it's not nice, well-behaved, random measurement error. So all your modeling effort is built on those statistics. And your evaluation, your predictions are being evaluated against those same statistics in the future. Yeah. So are you modeling reported data when you really want to model the real events, the real number of cases, the real hospitalizations, the real deaths?
So every team has an underlying model that is modeling the real number of infections. So just a little technical epi thing. If it's only a case if it's a report, otherwise it's an infection. So, but every team has a fundamental mechanistic model that's actually modeling those underlying number of infections. So then they have some observation process ranging from pretty sophisticated ones to just scaling, that attempts to map those to the observed outcomes, hospitalizations, deaths, and cases.
I guess I'm saying I don't trust those statistics though. I mean, you're evaluating those against new reported statistics.
Right. But
deaths are probably an undercount reported cases now, but testing things are probably
right, but we're trying to model, so we have a model, everybody has an internal model of the actual deaths, the actual infections and stuff, but then they submit their model of the report. And that's we had a debate about that, and we still go back and forth this sometimes. Do we ask for the number of people who are actually infected, or do we ask for the number of people who are reported to be infected? And we decided early on, though we say this exactly what you say is limitation, we decided early on that it would be better to have a observable outcome to compare to, even though that's an imperfect observable outcome, than focus on the underlying number of cases. So underlying state of the system. And sometimes we do ask teams to report the underlying state of the system for internal stuff with the CDC or something like that. But we really decided it's that we would focus on those report outcomes, because just to avoid the situation where we had nothing to evaluate, right? To say, okay, we projected this, and I have been in rooms where people have literally told me, I said, well, your model isn't, I can't point to anything in the real world, your model's matching, and people have told me, this isn't for COVID, this report, and people tell me, well, my model's right, and the data from the real world is awful. And they might be right, but that's not an argument or a thinking that can go forward. And if we want people in, from my view, if we want people in policy or just individuals or in companies to use this, they have to have something with which to at least evaluate face validity. So, so that's why we err on that. But that's not to say that you're not completely right about these things. And going back to my first love in using epidemic models would be, what I'd much rather be spending my time doing instead of this operational stuff I feel obligated to do would be to be working on how do we get those fundamental true numbers out from the observations, because I think that's a really interesting and important problem. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. How do you define the scope conditions of the models that should be put into an ensemble? So, in other words, let's say, you've got different statistical approaches to, projecting or forecasting, but then you have different assumptions in the different models, or different and you said yourself, you want to compare apples to apples. Right. So can the models, is it useful to have variation across models in the assumptions of how people are going to dynamically respond to things and such? Or do all of those things have to be the same and then you just have different statistical approaches to estimate parameters?
Yeah, so we sort of, we try to have it both ways.
I'm sorry, the folks online can't hear the questions. Could you repeat?
Oh, okay. So the question here was, how do we decide what, I'm going to summarize, how do we decide what is defined by the scenario and what people have to agree on if they submit, and what people can do whatever they want on. And we sort of have, we kind of have, it's actually almost a gradient in how we have it. There are the things that are defined by the scenario. That are the things in that grid plus a whole list of other things that is, varied over the year and a half, exactly how much it is. And it's like everybody has to be the same. If it's in that scenario definition, you got to agree on that. There are things where we provide guidance and guidance and data sources that people can turn to, but we don't dictate exactly, right? Or we give a range, right? Like to say you can't put in something which, based on our assessment, the coordinating team of the science is completely crazy, but you can do, you can deal with the uncertainty that's there how you want. And then there are things we just don't define. And so in teams, and the things we don't define, teams are free to do whatever they want on the things we define. The the thing, they need to do, they can do whatever they want. They stay in their lane. And then the things that define the scenario, they have to do exactly. It is a challenge. We're an open collaboration. So anybody who says, I have a model, I want to be part of this, is welcome. And unlike the Forecast Hub, for all these reasons I've talked about the challenges of that evaluation, unlike the Forecast Hub, where they can say, okay, based on past performance, I'm going to weight these models this way, because they have this very clear outcome. It's a little harder to say how we can do that. We also have less models and just less rounds, right? The Forecast Hub comes out every week they're at 125 some or more weeks for which they have data to compare with and do those type of things that say, okay, these models tend to have a weighted ensemble, and we haven't been able to do that. That being said, and this is getting a little beyond what you asked, but I think is interesting and important, is we chose to ensemble something or ensemble things by this approach called a linear opinion, which preserves much more of the probabilistic distribution of the component forecasts than a lot of other approaches to ensembling. And it's sort of based on a difference in fundamental ideas about what each forecast represents. So on traditional, like this called the Vincente method, but on some more traditional methods that give narrower intervals, you're kind of assuming that every single submitter is sampling from the same pre-existing distribution, right? and you're getting people who are on some sort of smooth distribution and sampling from it, and they're giving their uncertainty, but they're coming from there and that. And so it's almost like it's uncertainty about a process that everyone agrees. The linear opinion pool actually comes from sort of a different part of the literature, as I understand it, where you have a bunch of different experts, that may have completely radically different views about the world and the way it works, and or the current state of the system, and you want to preserve some of that really fundamental uncertainty that like, so there can be multiple peaks or stuff like that in your sort of distribution of that. So we found that for this task where we have the kinds of uncertainty that you're alluding to, that this linear opinion pool method just does a lot better than the more traditional.
I have a question.
All right.
There's actually about the uncertainty that you just talked about, but I have a million questions. The one I want to ask is about whether you give guidance on, like, up till now, what the assumptions should be about the model. Was that a part? Because I think I didn't realize when we talked about this before was how different the scenarios were for every round. And kind of like, how do you provide any guidance to the teams themselves about, like, where to start your model at, or kind of, from where this modeling period is?
I mean, we'll come yell at you if your starting point appears very uncalibrated. But beyond that, it depends. So, I mean, the short answer is, for the most part, no. So sorry, it's supposed to be repeating the question. So the question here was, do we say anything about what people can assume about the past? And the answer is, for the most part, no. The exception being when we're talking about an assumption about a variant for which we have data on. So if there's a variant, we're saying, oh, this is our assumption about Omicron. Any Omicron data you have should be fit with that assumption, right? Or another is immunological waning, right? We're saying something about a process that has been in place for at least a while, or whole pandemic. And we do have had times where, because of those back assumptions, like one or two teams will say, well, to have this assumption in place and our model going all the way back, we actually have what looks like the more optimistic scenario being more pessimistic, because you need to assume other things to be worse to explain the past under that assumption, right? So that does happen, but for the most part, we leave it open. And part of that is, or one of the drivers of that is just, we don't want to dictate model complexity, right? We're in, early on, it was less of an issue, because when we started, there was no variants or anything, or vaccination or anything like that. Now, I worked it out, and there's 2,000 some unique combinations of variant, infection history, variant vaccination history, and the like that you could potentially have, so, and nobody can do a decent job, or at least to make a fittable model that captures all of those underlying states and the like. So different teams are having to simplify the state of the system in different ways. And that means they have to treat past data in different ways. So that's sort of, so that's why we try to limit how much we say about what you do in the past, or how you get the state of the system. When we have more time and there's not a crisis every little bit, I think it would be fun to go back and like do sort of redux on particular rounds or places where things were hard, to see how we could have done better using the data we had at the time. But thus far, we've been in crisis operational mode for a year and
Okay, I think we're at time, so thank you, Justin.